This is a Construal level theory session, and I'm happy to see all of you here. We have a nice mix of really new directions in Construal level theory, and this is the studies on emotion, basically a meta-analysis on how distance affects intensity of different emotions, depending on how abstract or concrete they are. And this is the first talk by Tal Moran. Then I'm going to look at generalization in learning, one of the most basic questions in cognition. Basically, when we learn, what do we learn? And over there, we also propose, Hadaram will propose moderation of distance. And then we will have a look at a study that is more kind of directed towards replication, or rather supplying more updated evidence for a question that is basically old. We're going to look at the effect of hypotheticality on level of Construal, and Guy Greenfield will present this talk. And then a new thing, a completely new thing, will Ravit Nussinson will conclude with the relation between speed and Construal level and psychological distance. So this is a very varied and rich program. We're going to, each of the speakers will have 20 minutes, and that includes questions. If you have questions, please send them to Ravit Nussinson. She's the head of the chair, via the chat. So basically, we are running 5 minutes after what is indicated in the program. We are going to start at 1:35 and go 20 minutes from there. We will have 20 minutes for discussion at the end of this session. I am going to take the questions. If you have questions, you can also send them to me, or I will communicate with Ravit. At some point, I will disappear. I'm now at my home. I will disappear and reappear in my office, but in the middle, I will be following you on my Zoom on the phone. So that's not a complete miracle. So let us start with Tal Moran. Tal, please.
Okay, thank you. Just a minute. Okay, oops. Yeah, okay. Okay, I'm just taking my time. Okay, so thank you for coming. And common knowledge is that we react less intensely to more distant objects. For example, a parking ticket, from last year is less painful than a parking ticket from yesterday. A hurricane thousands of miles away causes less stress than a hurricane nearby, and the good fortune of a distant contact is less exciting than a good fortune of a close friend. In the last couple of decades, extensive research directly examined the effect of psychological distance on the intensity of emotions. According to Construal level theory, or shortly CLT, there is a relation between psychological distance and level of abstraction. An event or an object can be remote from direct experience in different dimensions. It can take place closer or further into the future or the past, or in other words, temporal distance. It can occur in near or distant locations, which is spatial distance. It can happen to people who are closely or remotely related to oneself, which is social distance. And it can be more or less likely, which is hypotheticality. According to CLT, more distant objects are construed or appraised at a higher level and are processed more abstractly. In the last couple of decades, extensive research tested the effectiveness of psychological distance and abstract processing strategies in emotion regulation. For example, research tested the effect of self-distancing, which involves changing the perspective from which the individual recalls and processes the emotional event, while adopting either an observer perspective or a self-immersed perspective. Other research tested the effect of using abstract processing versus concrete processing when analyzing an emotional event. Theoretically, psychological distance and abstract processing manipulations for emotion regulation are related, because it has been suggested that the effectiveness of psychological distance in non-regulating emotion is related to the abstract thinking this perspective promotes. Distancing leads to the generation of less concrete, more abstract mental representations of the emotional event, which are more cool, less hot, and include less emotional features of the experience. So because distancing operates through abstraction, psychological distance and level of abstraction manipulations should have similar effects on emotion regulations. So what the research found regarding the effectiveness of these two strategies were the results are mixed. On one hand, some studies found that adopting a psychologically distant perspective and using abstract processing attenuate emotional experience, meaning that these are effective strategies. On the other hand, other studies found that adopting psychologically distant perspective and using abstract processing does not attenuate, and in some cases may even increase the emotional experience. So we propose a novel hypothesis, which we call the Construal matching hypothesis, that we think can resolve these contradicting findings in the literature. Specifically, we suggest that the effectiveness of psychological distance and level of abstraction manipulations depends on the level at which the emotional event that we want to regulate is construed or appraised. According to our theoretical framing, different emotions differ from each other in the level of control of their elicitors. Some emotions, for example, basic emotions such as fear and sadness, which we term low-level emotions, are experienced when people construe the emotional situation using more low-level concrete representations. For example, when they are considering lower-level goals or context-specific information or the local features of the eliciting situation. Other emotions are, for example, self-conscious emotions such as guilt and shame, which we term high-level emotions, are experienced when people construe the emotional situation using more high-level abstract representations. For example, when they are considering higher order goals or global implications of the eliciting event. For example, to feel fear or anger, people need to focus on the immediate threats or obstacles that the specific situation entails, without necessarily considering its broad, long-term implications or the perspective of other individuals. In contrast, to feel guilt or shame, people need to focus on global self-representations, other people's perspectives, moral principles, long-term concerns, all of which go beyond the characteristic of a specific situation and involve more abstract thinking. So what we argue is that strategies that operate through processes of abstraction or a distant perspective which involve abstraction will be effective in reducing the experience of emotions that necessitate a relatively low level control for their elicitation, because these strategies counteract the appraisal processes that elicit these emotions. In contrast, abstract processing and a distant perspective are likely to be ineffective in reducing the experience of emotions that necessitate a relatively high level control for their elicitation, because these strategies maintain and may even intensify the appraisal processes that elicit these emotions. So to test this theoretical idea, we conducted two meta-analyses that examined the effect of psychological distance and level of abstraction strategies for emotion regulation. And by testing the moderating effect of the type of experienced emotion, whether it is low level or high level according to our definitions, we were able to directly examine the Construal matching hypothesis. So we conducted two separate meta-analyses, one that included psychological distance manipulations and one that included level of abstraction manipulation. To do that, we identified published and unpublished studies that manipulated psychological distance or level of abstraction and tested their influence on emotional experience. And we did it via three methods. First, we searched for relevant articles on two online databases using combinations of multiple keywords. Then, in each of the articles that we identified with the first method, we looked at the references to see if we missed some important citations. And we also sent multiple emails requesting unpublished data that are relevant to our research question to the SPSP listserv. Then we decided, according to predefined and pre-registered criteria, which studies should be included and which should not in our meta-analysis. So the list of inclusion and exclusion criteria is longer. You can see it in the paper, but for example, we included only experimental studies, studies that included both distant and near and both abstract and concrete conditions, and studies that included an emotion induction in different, using different strategies, and at least one measure of self-reported emotional experience. We excluded studies also based on pre-registered criteria. For example, studies that measured participants' natural perspective or processing mode and then asked them to switch it, or studies that confounded distancing with other strategies, for example, distancing and positive reappraisal. And of course, we had to exclude studies with missing data after we sent multiple emails to authors. Some of them just ignored us. Some of them just told us that the study conducted like 20 years ago and they don't have the data. So these studies had to be excluded. Then we coded each study. So for each study, we extract the mean and STD of the self-reported emotional intensity in each of the two conditions. And we also coded some variables. Most of them were exploratory, but one of them was important confirmatory moderator, the type of regulated emotion, which we coded as high level or low level or unknown. And to do that, two hypothesis blind judges independently coded all the studies using a pre-registered protocol that we developed, and I will show you in a minute. And just want to say that the two coders agreed on 82% of the cases, and in cases of disagreement, we asked two additional coders to provide their own independent coding, and the majority opinion was adopted. And in case of tie, we just coded the study, the emotion, as unknown. So just, again, the protocol is very long. I can't detail all of it, but just to show you some examples. So the protocol detailed what determines whether an emotion is elicited following low level versus high level appraisal. So for example, the protocol specified that low level emotions refer to emotions whose experience follows from appraising the event in terms of concrete and local features, or follows from appraising the event in terms of physical and immediate outcomes. For high-level emotions, the protocol, for example, specified that their experience necessitates self-awareness or self-evaluation processes, or follows from focusing on a generalized sense of the self. The protocol also detailed which cases should be coded as unknown. For example, cases in which the induced emotion follows from appraisal that is both low level and high level. For example, if the instructions asked participants to recall event in which they felt both sadness and shame. And finally, the protocol also provided instructions about where exactly in the text they should search for clues regarding whether the induced emotion is low level or high level. And as I said, it's only a short description, but the protocol is available publicly online on the OSF. Everyone can just use look at it following this link. Okay. As for the analysis strategy, we computed effect sizes such that a positive effect size indicates lower emotional intensity in the distant versus near, or in the abstract versus concrete conditions. We use a random effects model and a multi-level structure that, in short, specify the correlated structure between effect sizes such that we could use multiple effect sizes from the same study. In each of the two meta-analyses, we also assessed publication bias via 3 different methods. Okay, let's jump to the results. Starting from the meta-analysis on effects of psychologically distance manipulation. So these analyses included 230 effect sizes from 100 different studies reported in 77 different articles. And we found that overall, the effect of psychological distance on emotional regulation was medium and positive, meaning that overall this is an effective down-regulation strategy. The methods to test publication bias produced mixed results, so some of them indicated publication bias, some of them did not. So it's just inconclusive whether this effect size is too large due to publication bias. Importantly, emotion type was a significant moderator. What we found is that psychological distance yield larger effect size when it was, meaning that it was more effective than regulation strategy for low-level emotions than for high-level emotions. But in both cases, it was an effective strategy. So the effect was positive and significant in both conditions. And this pattern of result partly support our hypothesis because on one hand, it does show that psychological distance manipulations are less effective for high-level emotions, but it was still effective down-regulation strategy for these emotions. Okay, as for the second meta-analysis about level of abstraction manipulations, it included 98 effect sizes from 49 studies reported in 36 different papers. And here we found overall effect close to 0, non-significant, meaning that overall level of abstraction is not effective down-regulation strategy. Here, the 3 methods to assess publication bias produced the same results, suggesting no publication bias in this literature. Importantly, here too, emotion type was a significant moderator. What we found is, again, that abstract processing yield larger effect size for low level than for high level emotions. Here, the average effect size was positive and significant for low level emotions. So level of abstraction is effective down regulation strategy for low level emotions, but for high level emotions, the direction of the effect was actually negative, although not significant. And this pattern of results provides stronger support for our Construal matching hypothesis because it does show that level of abstraction manipulations are not effective in down-regulating and may even increase the intensity of high-level emotions. So to sum, we found strong support for the Construal matching hypothesis in the context of level of abstraction manipulations, but only partial support in the context of psychological distance manipulation. And we think that the findings are likely to show that abstraction is not the only factor that underlie the effectiveness of psychological distance manipulations. Probably other factors contribute to the effectiveness of psychological distance on emotion regulations. But I think that our work provides novel theoretical grounds for identifying effective strategies for regulating different types of emotions. And I just want to thank Professor Tal Eyal, that was my partner on this very challenging project, and to staff Chen, Eileen Baidani, and Oren Bornstein for their help in this project. And now for questions. Thank you. I will stop sharing. Okay. Yes, Ravit.
Yes. So one question is whether valence of emotion moderates the effect.
No. So we also coded if it's positive or negative emotion. I have to admit that the cases for positive emotion were rare. So it was like 20 effect size for positive emotion versus 100 and something for negative emotions, but it was not a significant moderator in both meta-analyses. So, but I don't know how can, I mean, it's not fair to do this comparison because these differences in cases. Yeah.
Thank you, Tal, and thank you for an excellent talk. It was very interesting. Thank you. Other questions? No other questions yet?
You can go and read the paper. It was just accepted for publication like 2 weeks ago. So.
Great. Congratulations. Okay. So let us move to the next speaker, Hadar Ram, please. Thank you, Tal.
Oops. Do you see my screen? Okay, perfect, thanks. So hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. And my name is Hadar and I will be talking about the effect of psychological distance on generalization in predictive learning. This is a joint project together with Guy Greenfeld and Professor Niran Lieberman, who are both with us today. Okay, so one of the main purposes of learning from experience is to enable predictions, because past experiences are a powerful source for predicting future events. So for example, let's say that we meet a new employee for the first time, and he or she is doing a wonderful job. In that case, we will probably learn to predict that quality of job from that employee, so that next time we'll have a challenging task, we'll probably turn to that employee and expect the same quality of job. And people constantly make predictions about certain outcomes or certain situations in their environment, and they usually base those predictions on their past experiences. So, for example, when we enter a Zoom full of new faces, we kind of automatically make a prediction about who looks shady and we might want to stay away from, or who look friendly and fun to hang out with. As consumers, we usually decide what to buy based on the predicted quality of the product. And even in organizational context, when you think about the hiring process, it's literally based on predicting who will be a good employee or a good colleague. So if predictions are so prevalent and so important to so many aspects of our life, I want to go back to the question, how do we make those predictions? And I partially answered that by saying that it's based on learning from experience, right? So when people repeatedly experience that a certain employee is followed by a certain quality of work, they learn to predict high performance. But in order to be useful, these predictions have to be generalized to other employees that are similar, but not necessarily identical to the same employee that we encounter, right? And when I say similar, that could be people who graduated from the same university, people who have the same work experience, who work in the same industry, and so on. So if predictions involve learning and generalization, and if generalization is based on similarity, then an interesting question, at least for us, was, okay, but what is considered similar? How far can we go from that original employee that we met and still expect the same outcomes, still expect high performance? And if you attended this symposium, you're probably not surprised to hear that we thought that it's related to psychological distance. And specifically, our hypothesis was that psychological distance versus proximity would increase generalization. And this hypothesis is based on Construal level theory. And as Tal well explained, Construal level theory defines psychological distance as any divergence from the direct experience of myself here and now. Now, as human beings, our physiological senses limited us to experience only the present. But we care about a lot of things that are beyond these limited experiences of the present, right? We care about what will happen in the future, like if we'll meet this employee within a year or 10 years from now. We care about people in other places. We care about whether, for example, we really care what happens in Europe right now or in the US. We care about other people's points of view and also about less likely situations or what could have happened if. So how do we transcend the present, given that our physiological senses limit us to the present? According to the theory, we use abstraction or high-level construals to transcend the present. And abstraction is actually a process of reducing an input into its primary and invariant element. It's about entering some kind of stability into the uncertainty that is inherent in distal situations, right? So if we're comparing between meeting this new employee tomorrow versus 10 years from now, if I'm thinking about tomorrow, I have a very concrete representations of what we're going to work on. But if I'm going to think about what happened within 10 years, or maybe I'm about to meet him or her next year, then I'm less certain about what are the types of projects that we will work on. And so I can call it more abstractly, oh, we'll probably work on research, hopefully. And that is something that is more inclusive or represent in a wider category. So going back to the hypothesis, if psychological distance increased the use of abstract or more inclusive categories, we thought that it should also increase the tendency to connect the outcome to less variable and less contextual aspect of the predicting stimulus, and thus construe it in a wider term that allow wider generalization. So that was the hypothesis and the background. Now, in terms of how we measure that, in this project, we use the predictive learning paradigm. In this paradigm, the participants' goal is to learn which stimuli predict the appearance of the outcome. And the stimuli are rings of different sizes, and the outcome is a drawing of a lightning bolt. So very basic stimuli, very simple procedure. Overall, the procedure includes 2 phases, learning and generalization. This is an example of a typical trial. So within each trial, 1 circle appears on the computer screens, and participants are asked to indicate their prediction regarding the appearance of the lightning bolt on a scale ranging from 0, certainly no lightning, to 10, certainly lightning. So let's do a few trials for example. So let's say that I pressed 7, I saw the lightning bolt, then there's a screen saying the next tile starts now, then I'm seeing a larger ring, this time I'm pressing 8, there's a blank screen, and so on. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are 2 phases, learning and generalization. In the learning phase, only 2 rings appear. A medium ring is paired with the outcome and therefore called as plus, so plus is for predicting the outcome. A large ring is never paired with the outcome and therefore called as minus, so minus for predicting the absence of the outcome. During the generalization phase, we have 6 identical blocks. Within each block, there are 2 presentations of S plus followed by the outcome, 2 presentations of S minus, and 1 presentation of each one of 8 novel rings, varying in their perceptual similarity to S plus and S minus. Now, going back to the hypothesis, we predicted that distance would increase generalization. Now, in this paradigm, given the shape of the generalization gradient, generalization can be made both from S plus and from S minus. So as you can see here, S plus is placed on the middle of the generalization gradient and S minus on the edge. Now, we have 2 sets of generalization stimuli. Here, the first set, the one that are marked in black, they are placed in the middle between S plus and S minus. So they are a bit tricky because they could be influenced both from generalization from S plus, which would call for enhanced prediction of the outcome, but they also similar to S minus, so they could be also be affected from generalization from S minus, which would call for reduced prediction of the outcome. Now, the second set of generalization stimuli, the ones that are marked here in green, they are more similar to S plus than to S minus, and therefore, as a first step, we focused on these generalization stimuli, and I marked them here in green because in a second, when I'll show you the results, I'm gonna ask you to focus on the green circles. So to set our hypothesis in more concrete terms, we predicted that distance versus proximity will cause higher predictions for generalization rings that are smaller than S plus and on the opposite side of S minus. Okay. In the first experiment, we manipulated temporal distance by telling participants when their learning would be applied. We invited people to participate in a study that includes two phases, two sessions actually, one this week and the second one within a week later. In the proximal condition, we told participants, you're going to do a simulation of the learning task and the actual task will take place immediately after. In the proximal in the distal condition, we told them, you're going to do a simulation of the learning task and the actual task will take place next week. Now, the reality was that both of them did the task within the first session in the exact same time. The only difference was in the instruction, meaning when they thought that their learning would be applied. So those in the distal condition thought that they are going to do that next week. And to equate between the two experimental conditions, we told both of them that next week there's going to be a personality questionnaire. So they were both prepared for a second session. Okay, so when we looked at the results, we started by making sure that participants learn to differentiate between S plus and S minus. What you see here is only the learning phase. On the x-axis, we have the trial numbers, so learning over time. And on the y-axis, we have their prediction. 0 is certainly no lightning, and 10 is certainly lightning. The two upper lines are predictions for S plus. The two lower lines are predictions for S minus. What we see here is that over time, participants learn to differentiate between S plus and S minus, and there's no difference between the two experimental conditions that are represented here as the two lines. So a solid line is the distal condition and the dotted line is the proximal condition. Okay, now when we looked at the generalization phase, we started by analyzing the first generalization block. Here on the x-axis, you have all of the stimuli arranged according to their size, their similarity to S plus and S minus, and the y-axis is the prediction. As I said before, the green rings are the one that we focus our prediction on. And so what we see here is that as we hypothesize, the predictions were higher in the distal condition comparing to the proximal condition. So generalization from S plus was higher in the distal condition than in the proximal condition. We then moved to examine all of the 6 generalization blocks. So what you see here on the x-axis is basically the mean prediction across all 6 blocks. The y-axis is the same, their prediction. And focusing on these 4 rings, we see the same pattern of results. So higher generalization in the distal condition than in the proximal condition. In the second experiment, we manipulated spatial distance, and in order to strengthen the manipulation, we also manipulated the expected variability. So in order to do that, we needed some kind of a framing or a cover story to the experiment. And so what we told them in the spirit of Corona was, okay, so these rings represent samples of bacteria, and your goal is to predict which samples are pathogenic and which are not. Now, the procedure was very similar to the previous experiment. It's just that instead of using a drawing of a lightning bolt, we use the word pathogenic versus not pathogenic. Everything else was similar. Okay, so what exactly did we tell them? Those in the proximal low expected variability condition were told you're going to learn about samples of bacteria from one lab, and later you will be presented with samples that were collected in the same lab. In contrast, those in the distal high expected variability condition were told you are going to learn about samples of bacteria from one lab, and later you will be presented with another batch of samples that were collected by different labs across the world and thus may get distorted. Again, when we looked at the results, we started by analyzing the learning block, the learning phase actually. And what you see here is that participants learn to differentiate between S plus and S minus a long time. And once again, we don't see a difference between the two distal conditions here. However, when we looked at the generalization phase, again, starting by looking at the first generalization block and focusing on these 4 rings, we see the same pattern of result as in experiment 1, meaning that participant in the distal condition gave higher prediction to the rings comparing to the proximal condition. And that was also true when we looked at the entire generalization gradient and looking on the average across all 6 blocks. We basically see the same basic effect of higher generalization in the distal condition. So to conclude, I started with the question how people make prediction, and I said that it's based on learning and generalization. What I suggested here is that, hoping that I convince you, is that psychological distance also affects generalization, and it increased generalization. I showed it by using the predictive learning paradigm across temporal and spatial distances, and this is basically demonstrating the basic effect on psychological distance on generalization, because this paradigm limits us to look at generalization in the sense of perceived similarity. What we are now working on is looking on other types of generalization, such as conceptual generalization and so on. I'm not going to get into that because I want to show you one of the more natural expansion of this project, which is the implication for social context or social judgment, basically. So in a project that we're working on these days, we're using the same paradigm. So we have the learning and the generalization phase, and we still have S- and S+, but instead of using the basic rings, we're using social stimuli. We use faces as the stimulus that participants learn on. And then when we examine generalization, we looked at the degree of similarity between, it's actually a morph between S+ and another phase. So we manipulated different dimensions of distance. I'm not going to get into this now. I'm just going to tell you about our future plans. So after we show the basic effect with faces, that distance increased generalization, what we intend to do is to replace the drawing of a lightning bolt, the very basic and neutral outcome, with a valence outcome and with behavioral outcome, basically. So looking at friendly versus unfriendly, or hard worker versus lazy, and to see if distance can also affect the predicted behavioral outcome. We also interested in valence asymmetry, whether there will be a difference between positive behaviors or negative behaviors, and also to examine more closely the effect of distance on generalization by using a memory task. So looking, after we ask participants whether they predict the outcome and to what extent, asking them whether they think it's a new face that they previously saw, or it's whether it's a new face that they haven't saw before, or it's an old one that they learned about. And by doing so, we hope to see whether distance affects the threshold or just the category that people use when they're predicting outcomes. So thank you for bearing with me for this talk. And I also want to thank my wonderful coworker, Guy Grinfeld, and Professor Nirali.
Okay, great talk. Thank you, Adar.
Thank you.
Really, thank you. Are there any questions? Yes,
yeah.
please.
Yeah, lovely, very interesting talk. I was just wondering, when you say that, I'm trying to understand, do you view it as like you have induced them to think of a different construal and we have sort of a spillover effect? Or you think that this is part of the task itself? Like this is like the manipulation of the construal level is not completely clear to me in sense of like how robust do you find it to be?
So that's a good question. And so in another project in which we use it, we use a manipulation that is more inherent within the task. So we manipulated, so one of the dimensions that I mentioned is hypotheticality, which is the probability. And there, what we do, we manipulated basically the reinforcement rate. So is it very likely or less likely? The outcome, is it likely or less likely? And we see the same results. Now, in this manipulation, it's more inherent in the task. in the one that I just described. But in what I showed you in this talk, it's something that is more like top down, right? So when their learning would be applied. So in kind of similar, and we were very excited to see that the pattern of result that emerged is quite similar. Because here, you know, when you're asking about what exactly is the mechanism, then I can tell you what I think is the mechanism. I can tell you what I manipulated and what I see in the results. According to the theory, this is the process that we think that work. So in order to examine it more closely, we use different tasks, actually. We use different tasks and maybe asking them about, like, was there a rule that you decided based on, and so on. If that's answering your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Hadar, may I ask, does what you find imply that what I learned about one Chinese, a socially distant person, is generalized more easy or to a greater extent than when I learn about another Israeli, who is socially closer to me?
So yeah, we haven't used that manipulation, but yes. So the idea, and this is not something new, right? It's not something new because it's like an in-group and out-group, but it's just giving the perspective of psychological distance. And so what we hope to, the new directions that we're hoping to see is like how distance affects like different valence, and to see whether it can attenuate like negative generalization asymmetry, which is stronger. Yeah, but it's interesting to take a Construal level theory perspective on stereotyping and the effect that they're very robust of. And you know, we all experience that when we travel to a new city or a new town abroad, and when we see some kind of behavior and we say, oh, all of the Chinese are like that. But when it's my neighbor, then I'm not going to say that all of my neighbors are like that, or I would be more cautious. And it's a good question because it also talks about like the trade-off between accuracy and applicability, right? It gives some kind of function and also relating to Tal's talk, some kind of functional perspective on Construal level. Because if I'm learning from something that will happen in a year from now or in a week from now, there's no really, I'm not going to remember the exact side of the circle. And when I'm traveling to a new city, I'm not going to meet the same Chinese again, right? But if it's something that it's closer, if it's immediately after, then it makes sense to learn about the concrete aspects more.
Thank you, Hadar. Thanks a lot. Let's move to the next speaker. Guy, please.
Okay, can you see my screen? Okay. So thank you for having me today. My name is Guy and I'm a PhD student at Tel Aviv University under the supervision of Professor Nir Biderman. Today I'm going to present a joint project we had with Cheryl Baxlax and Yaakov Trupel. And if you're a member of the Facebook group Social Psychology in the Real World, you might have heard about their rash criticism about CLT findings. And I think that this talk is highly relevant to the replicability of CLT findings and some obstacles we face when we manipulate psychological distance. And I hope that this talk could contribute to this discussion. So to begin and to continue Hadar and Tal, CLT defined and established empirically 4 dimensions of psychological distance. And the effect of each dimension on mental abstraction was demonstrated in what has become a classic paper. Today I'm going to focus on the hypothetical dimension, and this dimension includes likelihood, probability, counterfactually, fantasy, and so it's quite pivotal in all aspects of higher cognition. However, compared to other dimensions of psychological distance, the effect of hypotheticality on mental abstraction was under studies. More importantly, a recent study by Calderon and some colleagues of her did not replicate 2 studies from the original Baxlax 2006 paper about hypotheticality. So our main motivation in this project was to close this empirical gap, and we wanted to verify the hypothesis that hypotheticality affects mental abstraction using a direct measure of mental abstractions and to test it in highly powered studies. I will break my talk into 3 parts. I will start by presenting studies about hypothetical events, then I will continue to talk about studies that manipulated hypotheticality of actions, and I will end with some recommendation in the studying of hypotheticality. So in the first 2 experiments, participants wrote about more and less hypothetical events in respect to their own life. We use both a new self-report measure and text analysis measure. In the first study, we asked participants to describe 2 meetings, one of them a meeting that participants wanted to happen and was likely to happen, and the other was a meeting that they wanted to happen but was unlikely to happen. So, for example, an unlikely meeting was described this way. We would have to meet randomly, or maybe at a charity event. We would talk about the charity or anything that came up naturally. I would feel excited and honored to meet and talk with him. It would be nice to have a long conversation with them. A likely meeting, on the other hand, was described this way. I would meet this person at their house to watch TV. We would most likely talk about what is on the TV. I would feel happy to be out of the house. So in order to measure mental abstraction, we adopted items from the memory characteristic questionnaire that was designed in accordance with reality monitoring theory to distinguish real from false memories. Most importantly, we can map this distinguish to the dimension of hypotheticality. We adopted 6 items and modified it to be relevant to imagined situation. After describing both the less and the more hypothetical meetings, we presented them their own descriptions and asked participants about the image in their mind. Was it black and white, or had color, had no details, or had much details? Whether in the image they were spectators or participants, and whether the location was vague or vivid. So we predicted that the image of the likely meeting would obtain higher average score compared to the unlikely meeting. And mTOR participants confirmed this prediction as the rating of the likely meeting was more concrete. So next we used the Bryce-Berg dictionary of concrete norms to analyze the descriptions of the more and less likely meetings. This dictionary includes 40,000 English words with rating from most abstract to most concrete. So for example, the word frog is rated as 5 and the word hope is rated as 1.25. To process the description, we first tokenized them and compared the words in each description to the dictionary and averaged the score of each description. So we found the same outcomes. The language used to describe the unlikely meeting was more abstract than the language of the likely meeting. The previous study may confound hypotheticality with knowledge. People may have more knowledge of a meeting that is likely to happen, and thus they could represent the likely meeting with more details. To deconfound knowledge, we designed a second study. In this study, participants were asked to write about the 2 initials of the person they knew equally well and that they would want to have dinner with each. After they write us their initials, we asked the participants to imagine the following situation. There are 2 raffles. In both of them, the prize is a gift certificate for dinner for 2 at a fancy restaurant. One raffle had low odds of 5% chance of winning, and the other raffle had high odds of 85% chance of winning a dinner for 2. We randomly assigned the names of the person they chose to each raffle and asked them to imagine they got 1 ticket to the low odds raffle and 1 ticket to the high odds raffle. In this study, participants first imagined the dinners they would have in case of winning the raffles. They then rated each of the mental image on the MCQ scale. And we found the same effect. The dinner of the likely win gained higher scores. Only after rating the mental image, participants had to describe each meeting, and we analyzed the text, but we didn't find any difference in the language used to describe them. So we think that this may indicate that the description followed the same scheme. So the first 2 studies examined mental representation of events, and now I will move to talk about a set of studies that use the behavioral identification form to measure abstraction of action. This set includes 3 experiments with a little twist. So for those of you who are less familiar with the BIF, it presents 25 actions and asks participants to choose the description that is more similar to how they represent it at the moment. So for example, the action making a list can be described by the abstract meaning of getting organized or by more concrete description of writing things down. Compared to the new measure I presented, the BIF has been widely used, so we can find consistency over dimensions of psychological distance, and we can also compare the effect we find to other dimensions. So, for example, a recent study established that found the effect on temporal distance on the BIF and found medium-sized. So in the first study in this set, we used a within participant design. Participants saw on each page one action with two questions. One asks them to choose how they would describe the action when it is a hypothetical possibility, and the other when it is a real action that the person is actually doing with random order of questions. So the simple way to test the effect is by counting how many actions were described with abstract meaning. And so higher counts means higher abstraction. Using a t-test, we found a big effect, a hypothetical action described more by the abstract meaning. We're also conducting a logistic mixed model with random effects for both participant and action, and found that the odds of describing a hypothetical action by the abstract meaning was more than 5 times higher when describing actual action with it. So, we were quite happy and wanted to replicate this effect using a between study participant. This time, half of the participants answered the BIF only when the action were hypothetical possibilities, and the other half only when the action were real actions that the person was actually doing. However, this time we did not find any difference between the conditions. We were quite dazed and we wanted to have a better look at the data. We used a manipulation check question to filter participants who didn't notice our manipulation, and the most important alternative were the first two. All were real actions that the person was actually doing, and all the actions were hypothetical possibility, and almost all participants chose one of these options. However, having a look at the confusion matrix, which shows which condition participants were assigned to and what they answered in the manipulation check questions, we found that most participants in the hypothetical condition answered correctly, while a minority stated that the actions were real. However, in the actual condition, much more participants answered that the action also described as being actual were hypothetical. And actually, we can't blame them. They did an experiment and they were told that to think about actual action in some hypothetical experiment. So it's quite confusing, right? So in the next study, we introduced to the previous study an explicit contrast. So in the hypothetical condition, participants describe action when they were hypothetical possibility compared to an action that a person is actually doing. And participants in the actual condition describe action when they were a real action that a person is actually doing, as opposed to being a hypothetical possibility. And this time we did find a predicted effect with more action in the hypothetical condition described by their abstract angles. So one concern is that a real action that a person is actually doing is referring to the present, while a hypothetical possibility may refer to the future. So just to be absolutely sure that our effect was driven by hypotheticality and not by temporal distance, we made 2 more applications, keeping the time of each question constant to tomorrow. And we found the effect was replicated both when we used a within design and when we used a between participant design. So I hope that I convinced you that hypotheticality does affect level of abstraction, and this dimension was less studies compared to other dimensions, and as you saw, manipulating it may be tricky. And we think that there are multiple reasons for this scarcity. First, we know that people distort probabilities, and thus manipulation that attribute the probability to an event can result in other representation. And if the attribution succeeded, we face another obstacle. For example, if someone would ask me to imagine myself actually climbing a tree, I might think this situation is less believable and more hypothetical than if I was told to imagine that I might climb a tree. Another option is to manipulate hypotheticality within a hypothetical scenario, but letting participants change hypotheticality level within these already hypothetical scenarios can be quite confusing. But we suggest that there is something deeper here. how likely something seems to be depends upon a set of relevant alternatives. So a 95% chance may be compared to 5% chance, and thus might represent high likelihood. But it is also possible to be compared to 100% chance, thus making it low likelihood. It's important to note that this problem can be raised in other dimensions as well, such as tomorrow can be compared to in a year or to now. So finally, we learned a great deal about hypotheticality, and we think that when you manipulate it in the lab, you should bear in mind what people could contrast your manipulation with. You can control for this either using a within designs that explicate the contrast, or by making the contrast in between design explicit by yourself. Second, you can anchor the manipulation to participants' current state, and this too can be made explicit as we demonstrated in our first set of studies. And last, you can, if you can't do any of this or want to secure your manipulation, you can try to ask manipulation check questions about the interpretation of your manipulation. So for example, you can ask, did you interpret tomorrow as in contrast to sooner, or rather as in contrast to later? And that's it. Thank you for listening. I want to thank my advisor Nira and to Sharon Yaakov, and you can find the preprint of this project in PsycArchives. Thank you. And I stop share.
Thank you so much, Guy. And let me compliment you for being able to study this dimension, the psychological distance of hypotheticality is perhaps the one that is most difficult to study, and done it so intelligently and nicely. So thank you for that. Any questions? May I meanwhile ask you if we combine lessons from your talk and Hadar's talk, maybe we can ask ourselves whether stories that are imaginary legends are ones that one can learn more or generalize more in terms of their lessons than those that are real life ones.
Yeah, I agree, but I think that it's important to know or to secure that people understand and know what is hypothetical and what is not. Because one problem is that, or like in this scenario, they know that the story is hypothetical and they can generalize better. We think that most of the time, or when people talk about probabilities, they don't really use the same contrast. When someone talk about 50% chance of something, one can think about this as high chance, and then other person can think that this is like 50-50. It's not so much. Yeah, so when you manipulate or use something that people understand is hypothetical, we think that the effect will emerge.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, I will move to the last talk, my talk. I need a second to share a screen with you. And then I'll need another second just to time myself. Okay, so hi everybody. And it is a pleasure for me to share with you our research on the manner in which people experience psychological distance and construal level. Let us begin by listening together to the beginning of a well-known song. Okay, so as you may have noticed, Judy Garland sings her song on this highly hypothetical and imaginary and psychologically distant land rather slowly. Now imagine for a moment that she was singing her song rather fast. Would you still be carried on the wings of the song to a psychologically distant and abstract place? We think that you wouldn't be carried as easily to a psychologically distant place in that case. As this anecdote seems to exemplify to us, our consciousness does not speak prose, it speaks poetry. And what do we mean by a consciousness speaking poetry? Dozens of findings inspired by embodied cognition approach and conceptual metaphor approach suggest that variation on one dimension of meaning imbues our experience on seemingly independent, unrelated dimensions of meaning. For example, social exclusion affects perceived temperature of the surroundings. We find these and similar findings exciting for two reasons. First, they seem to disclose the language of our consciousness. Mapping the associations between different dimensions of meaning, they unveil a little further the basis of our subjective experiences. And second, in line with the cognitive ecological approach, they seem to suggest that the language of our consciousness reflects irregularities in the environment and of our interaction with it. So, for example, social inclusion and social exclusion, it is assumed that they're associated in our mind with temperature because by and large, social exclusion situations entail greater spatial distance between people and hence lower ambient temperature. We suggest that if researchers are to map associations between different dimensions of meaning and of the physical world, then a central candidate and a pivotal organizing dimension of human experience is that of a psychological distance. And we would like to contribute our share to this endeavor by suggesting that both psychological distance and its representational counterpart, a construal level, are associated with another dimension of human experience, namely with speed. We propose the existence of two mental associations, one that what is psychologically distant is slow and what is psychologically close is fast, and the other is that high construal level is slow and low construal level is fast. We further contend that these associations exert specific effects on our subjective experience. So we know from CLT that psychological distance is associated with construal level. What we would like to try and show is that both psychological distance and construal level are associated with speed. What do we know about speed? Not much. An object speed, the speed with which a car is approaching us, the speed with which a prey is moving away from us, holds great significance to our survival and to our physical integrity. Attesting to the centrality of speed in the meaning that we extract from words, speed serves the most prominent scale represented activity, the third factor that Osgood identified as defining the semantic space. And indeed, the scale fast-slow was found to have the highest loading on that factor. And we also know that the mental representations of everyday objects include their speed. But in spite of its great importance as a meaning dimension, speed gained only a scarce amount of research attention. Now, why would speed be associated with psychological distance and construal level? So one inevitable regularity of our interaction with the world is that as we move by objects, the images of stimuli that are further away from us move more slowly on our retina. So this very basic association between stimulus speed and its distance serves as a pivotal cue of depth perception called the motion parallax. We all know it. What moves slowly on the retina is perceived as more distant. What moves faster on the retina is perceived as closer. Yet another regularity of our interaction with the world is that objects that are spatially more distant from the self take longer to affect it. They are slower to modify one's state of affairs. So, for example, a slice of pizza in a lot may be slower to satiate one's hunger than a slice of pizza in the next or nearby room. So there is a built-in association in our environment between the spatial distance of a stimulus and the speed with which it affects the self here and now. Mirroring these two irregularities is a parallel association in the functioning of the cognitive system, reflecting the fact that responding fast to close stimuli is indeed a survival must. So we know that response time to most stimuli is shorter in the lower part of the visual field where close objects are located than in the upper part of the visual field where more distant objects are located. So why would speed be associated with psychological distance? We know that spatial distance automatically activates the other three dimensions of psychological distance: the temporal, hypothetical, and the social dimensions. We just learned that spatial distance is associated with speed, and hence we think that in our everyday life, psychological distance is continuously coupled with speed, and hence this gives rise to an association in our minds between the two dimensions, such that what is far, later, they, and imaginary is slow, and what is near, now, we, and real is fast. And why would speed be associated with construal? Much because of the same rationale. We know that spatial distance activates higher construal level, and proximity, spatial proximity activates lower construal level. We know that speed is associated with spatial distance, and hence this recoupling in experience should give rise to the paralleling association in our minds, such that what is abstract is slow and what is concrete is fast. So I would like to tell you about 6 pre-registered studies that we ran. In this first study, we examined whether people experience concepts denoting psychological distance as compatible with slowness and concepts denoting psychological proximity as compatible with speed. We presented participants with on each trial with 2 music box, together with 2 concepts, allegedly the themes of songs, one denoting a psychological distance, the other denoting psychological proximity, and we asked them to drag and drop each theme to the music box that fits it best, following their gut feelings. This trial is a temporal dimension of psychological distance. This one is a social trial, and this one is a hypothetical trial. And as hypothesized, a proportion of trials in which participants drag and drop the concepts in accordance with the hypothesis was 77%, that is higher than chance level. And this was true for all 4 dimensions of psychological distance: the spatial, the temporal, the social, and the hypothetical dimensions. In study 2, we wanted to examine the effect of stimulus psychological distance on its speed. We told participants that there are places in which pace of life is slow and in which everything seems to move slowly. In contrast, there are places in which pace of life is fast and where everything seems to move fast. And we asked them to please take a moment to imagine a place which is very distant from where you are now, or in another condition to imagine a place which is very close to where you are now, and to please rate the pace of life in that place. As a hypothesized, participants who imagine especially distant place portray them in their eyes' minds as characterized by a slower pace of life than participants who imagine the especially close place. In study 3, we wanted to examine the reverse direction of the effect of stimulus speed on its psychological distance. We asked participants to imagine each of 20 common behaviors happening either slowly or quickly. And now we asked them to rate how imaginary versus real they experience the behavior to be. At the beginning of each trial, we used dots floating either slowly or fast to simulate the speed at which they should imagine the following action being performed. And as hypothesized, participants, those behaviors that were imagined as being performed slowly were experienced as being more imaginary than those that were imagined as being performed fast. In study 4, we examined whether people experience abstract concepts as compatible with slowness and concrete concepts as compatible with speed. We again used the 2 music box, the slow music and the fast music box, with 2 themes of songs, one a concrete concept, the other an abstract concept, and participants were again asked to drag and drop the concepts to the themes to the music box that fits them best. And again, the proportion of hypothesis congruent trials was significantly higher than chance level. In study 5, Michael Gilad and Almog Simchon examined whether speed and construal level are associated in written language. To assess words concreteness, they used the Bryce-Burt et al.'s concreteness norms, and they used the word embedding approach to assess for each concept its semantic proximity in Wikipedia and in the internet, in a sample of the internet, the concept fast and the concept slow. Semantic proximity is a tendency of the concept to appear next to the concept fast and next to the concept slow in text, and the difference, semantic proximity to fast minus semantic proximity to slow, indices the relative semantic proximity to fast. What I hypothesized was that the more concrete a word, the greater its relative semantic proximity to fast, and they calculated the correlation between relative semantic proximity to fast and the concept concreteness ratings, and they got a significant and a positive correlation of 0.21. which suggests that the more concrete the word, the higher its relative inclination to appear in text in the vicinity of the concept fast as compared to the inclination to appear next to the concept slow. In study 6, we examined the effect of stimulus speed on its construal level. We know that when 2 dimensions of a stimulus are associated, then when they are congruent, the stimulus is easier to process than when they are incongruent. So we hypothesize that when given the choice between construing a stimulus at a high level or at a low level, people should be more likely to choose the high construal level of the stimulus when it is slower than when it is fast. So we asked participants with respect to each of 25 the behaviors to please imagine that the behavior is conducted either slowly or fast, for example, locking a door. And then we asked them to please indicate which of 2 alternative descriptions best fit the behavior, either one that has to do with the goal for which we perform the task, so securing the house, which is a high construal level of the behavior locking the door, or another one which refers to how we perform the task or the means that has to do with the task. And this is a low construal level of the same behavior. And to simulate the speed with which the behavior is conducted, we presented at the beginning of each trial floating dots. So for example, participants knew that they should imagine the next behavior as being performed slowly. And they should imagine the next behavior as being performed fast. And as hypothesized, the proportion of goal-oriented descriptions allocated to behavior that were imagined as performed slowly was higher than for those who were imagined as performed fast. So to summarize, what words denoting psychological distance are experiences compatible with slow, and words denoting psychological proximity are experiences compatible with fast. People intuitively portray especially distant places in their eyes' mind as characterized by slower pace of life than close places. Participants perceive behaviors imagined as performed slowly as more imaginary. Abstract words are experiences compatible with slow, and concrete words are experiences compatible with fast. The more concrete a word, the greater its inclination to appear in text next to the concept fast. And participants construed behaviors imagined as performed slowly in terms of their goals rather than in terms of their means. What might be the implications of our findings? One implication might be that our findings shed light on the manner in which psychological distance and construal level are experienced by us. Another implication might be that the association between psychological distance and construal level and associations between different dimensions of psychological distance are driven, at least in part, by their mutual associations with speed. Some practical implications, perhaps psychological phenomena that are known to be affected by psychological distance and construal level are also affected by induced speed. So perhaps if we induce slowness on people, then the way they assign to desirability concern is versus the feasibility concerns in decision making is higher, or they make more concessions on low priority issues in exchange of favorable outcomes on high priority issues in negotiations, or the salience of pros as opposed to cons is heightened, or the role of values in shaping people's behavioral intentions is higher, or people show a broader, a more inclusive regulatory scope, which is how psychologically far one's mind reaches. Perhaps our findings also bear on marketing and persuasions, messages and ads involving abstract values and long-term goals such as health, sustainability, security and charity, and psychologically distant objects such as retirement, vacation destination, luxurious objects may be processed more fluently and may be more convincing when associated with slow pace, whereas ones that have to do with concrete concepts or psychologically distant objects may be easier to process and hence more convincing when associated with fast pace. And finally, we know that an expansive regulatory scope is vital, that is being able to think about more distant times and places and other people perspectives is vital for people's ability to manage increasing social diversity and complexity and change. Perhaps societies and organizations and cities and private people alike may want to combat the effect of today's fast-paced environment by designating specific places or times for taking life, however briefly, at a slower pace. I would like to thank my collaborators on this project, Inbar Rosenberg, Sari Menzer, Elit Hatzek, Maya Navon, Michael Gilad, Almog Simchon, and Nira Lieberman. Thank you. I'll stop sharing just a second. Okay. So I'm ready to take questions if there are any. I can't see everybody yet. Let me see if I can somehow get to see everybody. Hadar, did I see correctly that you had a question or no?
No, I was clapping actually.
Okay, thank you. And Boaz, do I see that you have a question?
Yes. So first, thank you for the presentation, and thank all presenters. I'm an aficionado of CLT from the side, and I enjoy every meeting to see how it progresses. So I'm a speech person mostly. And while I was watching, I was texting with my students, and I was thinking about what happens when we look at fast speech. We know that speech rate is highly indicative of the emotional category, right? However, slow speech could relate to sadness, and sadness for you would be a close, right? Because it's a basic emotion.
Mm-hmm.
So, see what I mean? So fast, the rate of speech does not necessarily relate to emotions being very, very basic or very abstract. Does it make sense?
It very much makes sense, and I can say that I have much of an insight of how to understand this conflict, and of course not everything has to fit with our findings at all. I would like to refer to the fact that it might be that slower pace of speech signifies more power. So it signifies I take more space, I take more time, I speak slowly, and you listen to what I have to say. And power, we know, has to do with high construal level and with more psychological distance and with verticality, with vertical position. And we just found that also the vertical dimension of space is associated with psychological distance and with construal level, so that what is up is psychologically distant and also of high construal level, abstract, of course, and everything like that. So yeah.
I think that also there is a lot of research on slow being related to depression and fast being related to more positive mood, right? That's Emily Pronin and Dan Wegner. They did that stuff. So it's I mean, yeah, as Ravit said, not everything is, distance and construal level, which is good, but it's interesting to try to combine those things and see what we get then. I mean, I do agree with Ravit, not surprisingly, is that, I mean, what Judy Garland was kind of communicating with her slowness is this abstract hypothetical and not depression, right? So I think it's perhaps a question for musicology of why not, given what we know from Pronin and Wegner, right? What other qualities prevented it from going in the direction of depression? Or maybe some people do think it's depressing.
Nira, I think what helps is that she was looking up. And up has to do with
Okay, yeah. Well, yeah. So then that's nice. So like if you produce a matching clip with her singing about somewhere, deep in the earth and looking down, maybe that would be depressing.
So
sorry, my time.
We can think of speeding up speech and seeing what happens. You can speed up speech without changing the frequency, whatnot. We have the abilities to do it, right? And be interesting to see. So you gave me a lot of food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, please let's move to discussion. Nira?
Okay, thank you. So It's actually inspiring for me to see all of you together, because I think one of the things that we could do is to play the game of thinking about each other's talks in the context of each other, basically. So, for example, is it true that if you classify songs by the emotions they elicit, you would find faster speed or faster tempo in those that elicit joy compared to pride? So that would be interesting to even do a content analysis of that type. We can also ask Hadar for, and I mean, I'm just raising it for you to kind of like try to answer. Hadar, do you think that perhaps experiences that elicit pride or some kind of high-level emotions are generalized more broadly over the gradient of similarity of the eliciting stimuli compared to low-level emotions? So if like one of your circles elicited pride, it would generalize wider to more similar circles than if it elicited joy. So, and do you think it could be interesting to do something like that? And I also wanted to ask Tal Moran whether make you talk with Guy and ask you whether in your meta-analysis there was hypotheticality, and why do you think that is, and whether it would be interesting to study how emotions decay basically over the dimension of hypotheticality. Or does this question make sense? Or like, is it like when we, for example, when we fantasize about emotional events, let's say for a moment, positive emotions. So low level would be joy and high level would be pride. So is it easier to fantasize low likelihood pride than to fantasize low likelihood joy, right? That would be the prediction. So is it the case? Maybe it's not the case. That's all very interesting. So I will let you think about this and maybe react in a minute. But in the meantime, I wanted also to make a very kind of like abstract comment, and that is the idea that we came to think about distance in terms of variability, and that is reflected, I think, in Hadar's talk, in the sense that once you increase the scope, once you think about more distal events, you necessarily think about more variable stuff. So they are less similar to today. More will happen in the span of distance between me here and now and that distal event than close event. Different things would happen between now and a year from now than between now and tomorrow. And I thought it was interesting to think about your talk, Ravit, about speed in those terms, because one way of thinking about variability is basically speed, right? So it's like speed of change. So speed of change is also increasing variability, except that you kind of like condense it into the same time frame, right? If you condense something into the same time frame more, you get something that is more speeded up, so you get more variability. So in some sense, I think your project is related to this idea that perhaps underlies distance, which is how we treat variability, how we treat change, things that are dissimilar to each other and the need to put them together. So I think in a sense, your project of speed, I mean, well, one way to look at it is, yeah, it's all about, I don't know, advertising and songs, but another way to look at it is that it gets at really something basic about why we think this, or one of the basic reasons of why we think distance has this effect on Construal level.
Yes.
That is one thing. And if you want to discuss or ask about replicability, you are welcome to do that in any of the contexts. I think it's a fair concern, and I hope that the I do think that the studies here are convincing, but I'm willing to opening it for discussion from the audience. So I will call you up if you are not going to.
Nila, I can relate to one of the thoughts that you raised about the high level versus low level emotions. I think it's interesting. Of course, I need to think about it more, but I thought about generalization across contexts. Like low level emotions, I can feel, everyone feel joy or sadness. I hope that everyone can feel joy and sadness, but like those higher level emotions of pride, maybe, is it something that is more stable? I'm not sure, I'm just like scratching it up now. But is it something that generalizes across context, so I can feel a person who tend to feel pride over a few contexts?
It should be less related to specific context. I think that's the idea.
Okay, so it's not. Yeah.
It's a high level emotional, less context specific.
Okay, so it does.
Yeah, so in line with
so it goes in this direction. Okay.
Yeah. That's the idea, but I don't think there is any empirical investigation of it. If there is something you want to do together.
Hi, can I ask a question? First of all, thank you for the interesting talks. It was highly interesting for me because I'm studying spatial behavior, approach avoidance, distancing. So it was very interesting to listen to psychological distance. I wanted to ask you whether how do you feel the COVID influenced psychological distance? It's an open question.
At the beginning of just the first quarantine, I felt time was moving very, very slowly. So I had a feeling that something was stuck, something was not moving. I asked myself what could be, and I asked other people that told me that they had similar experiences. I thought maybe my agency stopped. I mean, I stopped moving from one place to another. I'm not sure what was happening, but I was asking myself whether that would have any implications for the other dimensions of psychological distance.
Yeah, we actually did a study. You know, you can never resist collecting data. It's not published. We collected it with Brit Hadar, and not to be confused with Hadar Ram. With Brit and Almog Simchon, who was also so basically Google released mobility data by US. You could get it by state and by county, and you can overimpose it with Twitter data. That's from Michael Gilad's lab. So they download Twitter data, and Twitter you could analyze for abstraction. So basically the question was whether locking people up and restricting their mobility, which you could think of as restricting their spatial scope, right? Does it coincide with a more concrete language? and also with lower temporal scope. You could use look for temporal indication. So the answer to the first question was yes, they do get more concrete, but we didn't get an indication for temporal. I'm not sure why. I mean, it's still, I mean, we never published it. We never kind of ended actually looking at it, but it's a very interesting question. I think I think people did experience something along these lines, that you are locked down and now you kind of you are this very concrete, right? You think about where I'm going to get the toilet paper, or how am I going to go to the grocery store, things like that. But I'm not, I mean, it wasn't reviewed and I'm not sure, but it's an interesting idea. I think it's, natural experiments are nice. Of course, they, come with a lot of, yeah, and another idea that was in the air, and I think many people here could relate to, is kind of basically the rupture of distances, in the sense that you are isolated, right? So first of all, you are isolated from your physical surrounding, right? So you are locked in your house and you don't know what's going on outside. And an interesting prediction is that also creates some rupture in the time. And I think people do experience that in the form of you first don't know what day it is, right? And then you don't know how much time passed. So you are kind of locking you in a space bubble also makes it a time bubble in a sense. So that's another, and in a social bubble, that's a distance prediction. So it's kind of a rupture on one dimension, also ruptures other dimensions, whatever that means. It's kind of distorts the perception of continuity. I think that would be the prediction. But again, I mean, no data. What people told me is that there is a phenomenon that is somehow feels similar, which is solitary confinement syndrome, which is presumably somewhat similar, but I don't know. I mean, it's for you to go and check it out.
Thank you.
So Tal, you as an expert on emotions, do you think it's worth studying how hypotheticality affects?
Yeah, I don't think I encounter studies that manipulated the psychological distance in the context of emotion regulation using hypotheticality. So yeah, I think that it's still an open question. I wonder how easy it is, because it's different to do it on something that's already happened to you. So
no, but it could be prospective. So for example, yeah, in risk perception, there is stuff on like earthquake, right? So now we are in an earthquake.
It's very likely.
Whatever likelihood, and then you manipulate the likelihood of of the earthquake and look at emotions that are associated, high level versus low level, and how they depend on the probability. And I think it could be actually interesting to look at Paul Slovik's project on perception of risk, where they do show some that for some, I'm not sure it's emotions, but anxiety could be independent of the actual probability of events, and even independent of the self-perceived probability of events. You see what I mean? So like how much I'm anxious of an earthquake would be a little bit independent of how I myself perceive the likelihood of an earthquake. something like that. But I'm not aware of comparing low level to high level emotions.
No, it's a new taxonomy. I mean, we have only few papers from TAL Lab on this issue. So
yes,
yeah, it's interesting direction. A lot of your ideas are interesting. I wrote all of them. So Guy, if you want, also I'm happy to collaborate.
okay, we are happy to take any questions from the audience. I don't see everybody, or do I? But if there are none, we can just call it a day and let you continue with your life. So thank you, Ravit, for organizing, and thank you everybody for really interesting talks. I mean, I kind of know it, but it was still interesting for me. And I hope that we got other people interested in psychological distance and its effects, and talk to us. I mean, we are real people. I mean, we look squares on your screen, but we are real. I mean, we're not hypothetical. And we are even close, relatively speaking, I think, for most of you, right? So talk to you soon and see you around.
Thank you.
Thank you.